Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Point Podcast. Everybody's doing well on this Wednesday, and what a day it has been. It's Wednesday, July 13th. You're thinking, well, not that much happening today. It's boring mid-July. This is the part of the sports calendar where there's nothing happening. There's nothing to talk about. It's how can we get through the day content-wise? We're battling to get to the weekend because there's just nothing to talk about. Well, that could be that's the farthest thing from the truth today, where we have free agent frenzy. We have all sorts of news happening around the National Hockey League, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to be breaking down everything that's happened so far today. Give you all the news, give you my thoughts on big free agent moves around the NHL. Some teams re-signing players. It started last night with Evander Kane returning to Edmonton. And as the podcast goes on, if we have any breaking news, I will let you know. There's still some big names on the board that I expect to be signed. There's Nazem Kadri has remained unsigned. You got Andre Palat. Johnny Gaudreau is still out there. I expected Johnny Gaudreau to be one of the first off the board just because he announced last night that he was leaving the Calgary Flames. They had a press conference where they did the full court press. They tried to sign Johnny Gaudreau. They did all they could. They offered him an 8-year deal at $9.5 million. And to me, good riddance. If you don't want to sign that deal, that's up to him. I wouldn't have offered him 9.5. That's way more than he's not a $9.5 million player year in, year out. I understand he had a great season, 100 points. He's a very good player. But to me, you pay $11 million to franchise players. Johnny Gaudreau might have been a franchise player in Calgary, but he was a franchise player in Calgary where they didn't win a goddamn thing, where they lost every year. They got to in Calgary, they got to the second round with Johnny Gaudreau as their best player. That's as far as they got. And wherever he goes, unless he goes to Long Island, which I don't see happening, that's been a report today, Lou Lamoriello is not going to give Johnny Hockey that big of a ticket, $10 million to go to Long Island. He's not going to be on a better team than he would have been in Calgary. He'll go to New Jersey, who, as you all know, if you listen to me, I have a soft spot for New Jersey. I watched them a lot last year because they were an awful team, and I just have this weird thing in my brain where I like to watch bad teams for some reason. And I could see him going there. Philly is still possible. They're another bad team. So to me, that's where free agency started, and it got into today. And I'm looking around, I'm thinking, well, who's the big winner of the day? Because there's so many moves to talk about. And I'm going to stick to teams that sign players from other teams. There's a whole bunch of Tampa, I think the Colorado Avalanche had a great day. But I'm just going to talk about players that left organizations. And to me, I look at today at two teams in particular in this free agency period that did not make the playoffs last year, that have done some important things to improve their roster so that they're not an embarrassment. They're not a doormat going into next season. And the two teams that come to mind right off the top are the Ottawa Senators and the Detroit Red Wings. First off, with Ottawa, I am hard on the Ottawa Senators. I have Ottawa people in my life that think I'm too hard on them, that I pick on them, that Ottawa isn't that bad, but I think I'm fair. Yes, I pick on the team, but they've been horrible for a number of seasons. They've made bad moves, and they've had one of the worst owners in all of sports until he recently passed away. Rest in peace, Eugene. But the Ottawa Senators in the past number of days got Alex DeBrincat, a multiple-time 40-goal scorer, for little to nothing. They traded for Cam Talbot last night, where Minnesota, for some reason, traded Cam Talbot for Philip Gustafsson straight up. They haven't made any signings today. So Minnesota, this wasn't a salary dump, if you ask me, unless they land a big player. They got dead money on their cap already. So this was Bill Guerin acquiescing to Cam Talbot being upset that Marc-Andre Fleury was signed to a contract extension that he'd have to share the net. So now he's an Ottawa Senator. And to pair these two moves, he moves out Matt Murray and swaps him with Cam Talbot. Cam Talbot makes less money. And to me, he's proven to be a better goaltender over the last number of seasons. Matt Murray might have a resurgence in Toronto. It's been, the response around Matt Murray is so negative that it almost guarantees to me that it's going to be a positive move. When everybody has an opinion that is the same, I like to buck that trend. That's just my brain thinking, okay, that everybody else is going to be wrong, because groupthink can also be a really negative thing, can also be a bad way to lean on life, is just to say, well, the majority thinks this way, so I'm just going to hop on this opinion. Those are lemmings. Those are lemons, if you will. People that don't have an opinion just latch onto somebody else's, and they think, well, okay, this is the right one. I'm the complete opposite of that, where people can have 100. I could be in a room with 100 people that have the same opinion. I will go against that opinion, sometimes to piss them off, and just because I'm different. But Matt Murray might have success in Toronto. It could be a great story. It could be a terrible one. I heard Jeff O'Neill reference that today on the TSN Free Agent Frenzy show, and I agree. It's either in 6 months, it'll be great, or it'll be a train wreck. I don't see it being in the middle, because it's either going to be great or bad, because the Leafs and that whole staff are going to be fired if it goes bad. But you get Cam Talbot. Phil Gustafson we got in a trade from Pittsburgh a long time ago for Milan McCulloch. It didn't work out. Okay, you move on from that. And then today you add Claude Giroux. And Claude Giroux is 34 years old. He had 65 points in 77 games last year. I like Claude Giroux. He's a good player. He obviously used to be great. When he was on Philly in his early years, he was one of the most dominant centers in all of hockey. He's had some legendary battles with Sidney Crosby, where in playoff series, Giroux was as good or better than Sidney Crosby in those respective 7 games. Not as good of a player all time, but in those games, he absolutely was as good as Crosby, because he beat him head to head. But looking at this move, at first, I didn't love it for the Senators, but I also look at what they've done and what they have around Giroux. He signs for $6.5 million. And what the main thing to remember here about this deal, because I don't think it's a great move. I don't think it's a terrible move. What I think the context has to be here is you have to look at the roster. This is what the Senators could look like in a few months. DeBrincat, Stützle, Giroux, Batherson, Josh Norris, Brady Tkachuk, Matthew Joseph, Shane Pinto, possibly Connor Brown, although it's rumored he might be dealt today, Parker Kelly, Alex Formenton. That's just some of the forward group. That's pretty good. It's a young group, some really unproven, but that's a fun team. At least it's a fun team to watch. Ottawa has been a nothing burger for the longest time. They've just been, oh, there's Ottawa, the fun-loving Ottawa Senators. We all love Ottawa. They haven't been interesting at all. But that group of players, that group of forwards up front can bring something to the table. So what I think Sens fans, and I think when I look at this move and I really break it down, you have to look at Claude Giroux as a player that is a complementary piece. He can play in the power play. To me, he's more of a second-line player than a first-line guy at 34. But he's an experienced dude. He's been to a Stanley Cup final. He's been around the block, and he's joining a young group of forwards that don't have a lot of veteran leadership around them. So Brady Tkachuk has to be better than Giroux. Batherson has to be better. Norris. I think they're at least 4 to 5 forwards that you'd hope are better than Claude Giroux. If he could be your top 6, and when you say top 6 forwards, it's always lumped in there. If he could be number 6, then I think your team is really firing on all cylinders. So Claude Giroux has to be brought in, to me, with the hope that he's a 65-point player. Not that he's Claude Giroux of old. This is the opposite of the Pittsburgh Penguins, which I'll get to in a second. I can't hate that deal anymore. But Claude Giroux is surrounded with pieces that are going to allow him just to be another guy, just to be another winger that has success, to me, and play his role. And that's perfect for Claude Giroux. But I have to give credit to the Ottawa Senators, who are finally saying, you know what, screw, we're tired of being in the bottom of the standings. We're tired of being another team in Ontario. They've always been behind the Leafs since 2016, 2017, really, when they made the made this the Eastern Conference Final. So now they're saying we want to be competitive next year. They got a goaltender that can play. Anton Forsberg is a very viable backup goaltender. He's extremely good between the pipes. So you have two guys that can go 50-30 in starts. That's a nice position to be in. I do think their back end does need to be improved. It's still a weakness of this team. They haven't addressed it yet. I know they were in talks to acquire Mackenzie Weegar, and they didn't follow through yet. So I still think the Ottawa Senators need to look at their back end at improving that part of their game. But I like what they've done. They just said, screw being an afterthought team, screw being the bottom feeder, and we want to try to push through. And it is going to be a changing of the guard because the Boston Bruins are an older team. They've been through the wars. They're talking about bringing David Krejci back. And I noticed I have a lot of friends. I got a lot of family members that are fans of the Bruins. Well, David Krejci coming back is not a positive signing. That's a legacy contract. The guy left to go play in the Czech Republic. Newsflash, not because he just wanted to be close to home, because he really couldn't play in the NHL anymore. Let's be honest. Enough of this kid glove shit. And I hear all the time, well, you're being so mean to people on Twitter. Yes, they're awful people on Twitter. I'm on Twitter. I hate a lot of people on it. But there's also, okay, this player wasn't any good. Why can't you say something bad about him? You can, because it's the truth. It's when you make up crap and that gets thrown into the narrative. That's when it's just false. That's when it makes no sense. But looking at David Krejci to Boston, that's absolutely a fair assessment. That's absolutely fair to criticize that. Tampa, I think, is going to be fine. They're going to lose Palat, which he hasn't signed anywhere yet. I'm extremely intrigued to see where he goes. To me, Palat is unsigned because we're waiting on Johnny Gaudreau. We're waiting to see where he goes. Palat will end up going to the team that ultimately doesn't end up with Johnny Gaudreau. For Andre Palat's sake, I hope he does not end up in Philly because he's not going to be going near a Stanley Cup final anytime soon. So there's that possibility. I think Florida, they've been quiet today. They lost Mason Marchment. They lost Ben Sherratt. They lost Giroux. So they're a team that is definitely worse off. They lost Andrew Brunette to the New Jersey Devils, who signed on to be an assistant coach there for the next 3 years. Likely the next head coach in waiting, but there's another theory for you. So Ottawa has an opportunity here. Sees that the division is changing. They could be in a position to compete this upcoming season. The key for Ottawa, and again, we're months away from this, is starting on time. For the last number of years, their starts to the seasons have been horrible. They lose 8 of the first 10. They're behind the 8 ball, and they can never catch up. And by December of this year, you knew Ottawa was not going to make the playoffs. You knew they were going to be picking the lottery, and you knew that the team was basically, you didn't have to watch them for the rest of the year if you didn't really want to. Also didn't help that Drake Batherson got hurt, so you really had no reason to watch the Ottawa Senators. They need to start on time. But when it comes to just today, just in this period, I like what they've done. I credit the Ottawa Senators for being active and not staying in the position. Not saying, okay, well, we're aiming to compete this year. We're aiming for no more 2 years away from being 2 years away. Compete now. They've been doing that. Kudos to them because nobody criticizes them more than me. Now, Detroit Red Wings. Detroit Red Wings today, on paper, they don't have the moves that the Ottawa Senators have made, but they play in the same division. And during this free agent period, I really like what they've done. So it started off with Detroit. They traded for the rights of Ville Husso from the St. Louis Blues, and they signed the 27-year-old to a 3-year contract worth $4.5 million a season. He's gonna get paired with Alex Nedeljkovic, who had a tough year last year, but Detroit was one of the worst defensive teams in all of hockey. So now you have a 1-2 tandem that I really like. Nedeljkovic was phenomenal in Carolina when he had an able backup with him. Funny enough, it was with Peter Mrazek, but they had an excellent season together. They almost won the Jennings Trophy. So I still like Alex Nedeljkovic as a goalie. I think Ville Husso is a solid guy. You have a 1-2 punch in net. That's not Johnny Burns. It's not Jimmy Howard. You can legitimately look at this team now and look at the goaltending and say, okay, that's pretty good. So I like that move. Then today, they landed a guy that, I'm going to be honest, he's one of my favorites. I love this player. To me, he's he's a game breaker if you need him to be. He's a perfect teammate, and he just does the little things right. Other than the only fault I have with this guy is that he has a tinted visor. I hate that look, but he's a great player, and that's Andrew Kopp. Andrew Kopp signs for 5 years, $5.625 million, so 28.125 total. Andrew Kopp is a perfect number 2 center. He can play number 3. He can play number 2. Andrew Kopp has played a third line role in Winnipeg forever where he was better than that role. Yet he never bitched. He never complained about it. He never asked out of Winnipeg. He just played. Every opportunity he got, he achieved. Every different challenge he took on. He got traded to New York midseason. He was phenomenal in the playoffs. He added something to that team that they didn't have, and he was a big reason why they kept winning while Artemi Panarin faded to the outside. New York had some options today. New York went and got Vincent Trocheck. I like Vincent Trocheck. The two are making the same $5.625 million a season. The only difference is that Vincent Trocheck has signed for 7 years, and Palat signs for 5. Trocheck's 29, and Kopp is 2 years younger. The reason I like Detroit's deal better is I think Kopp is a little bit better when it comes to his offensive game. Trocheck is a pain in the ass. He's more of a pain in the ass than Andrew Kopp when it comes to his style of game. But to me, Kopp is just a little bit of a better player, and I like 5 years more than 7. I don't like signing a 29-year-old to a 7-year deal. Again, a lot of the contracts that I look at and I really don't like, and it's half of it is because of the length of the deals. Why New York, a team that is on the precipice of winning, had to go 7 years for Trocheck is beyond me. And again, I'm not criticizing the deal all that much. I like Vincent Trocheck a lot, but I wouldn't have went 7 years on the player. The guy isn't a franchise guy. The 7 years when you're leaving a team is the max that you can give a guy when he leaves another organization. There's no way I'm giving Vincent Trocheck the 7 years. He's just not worth it. He's not a 7-year type pact of a player. He's a guy that you sign a 3 to 4, even a 5-year deal to, I'm okay with. So that's my one picking hairs with New York. Kopp, 5 years. Detroit is starting to me and Seamus talked about this yesterday, about Detroit making subtle moves, Detroit hitting it in drafts. Seider, Edvison, Marco Kasper, they draft good players. We're still waiting to see on Philip Zadina. That might be a miss. But if you can go 3 for 4 in your first-round picks and they're all really good players, that's pretty damn good track record with Stevie Yzerman. I like what they're doing. Kopp coming in. Dylan Larkin, it's rumored he's going to be re-signed today to a long-term contract. So you have Kopp, you have Larkin. You have some skilled players up front. Lucas Raymond looks to be an absolute stud. He's already playing really good at the NHL level. And not only do you get Kopp, you get Husso. They added Ben Sherratt today for a 4-year deal for Ben Sherratt. And Sherratt going to Detroit not only helps Detroit in my mind, but it hurts another contending team because I think some teams would have loved to have Andrew Kopp. Ben Sherratt. These two I get getting confused. Sherratt would have been great on the back end of a lot of teams competing for a Stanley Cup title. And they don't get Sherratt because Detroit scoops him up. Detroit hands Sherratt an extra year on the contract where contending teams offered him 3 years. Sherratt played extremely well in Winnipeg. He played extremely well in Montreal. He was fair in Florida during the playoff run. To me, he's still got some good hockey in him. He's not going to be asked to be the best player on the defense corps. Seider is. But he can play in your top 4. He's a solid guy. So 2 teams that you don't expect to really make a whole lot of noise, I credit for doing what they did today. Because, again, you can sit still and just say, well, we're rebuilding, but Detroit hasn't made the playoffs in 6 years. Ottawa has not made the playoffs since the 2017 season, so that's 5 years. So both these 2 teams have been on the same path. They've been down the same road. They've been at the bottom of the Atlantic Division standings for the last number of years together. They're always picking close to each other in the draft. You're seeing them on the stage a lot during drafts, quite frankly. So I love Andrew Kopp. He's a guy that he's a culture setter. He's got a work ethic, and he'll go on that team and they'll be instantly better because of his effort and just what he brings to the table on a day-to-day basis. To me, that's just what Andrew Kopp is. He's a worker, he's a team player, and I expect him to do great things in Detroit. Sherratt, similarly, he was on a Montreal team that had no expectations when they were in the it wasn't the bubble season, but it was when there was the Canadian division season, and he helped Montreal get to a Stanley Cup final. He played with Shea Weber on the top defensive pair, and he was phenomenal in that role. So again, a guy that's a team guy that can play in the big moments. He's proven that, and they bring him in, and then you get Husso. They've been searching for a goalie forever. Husso might not be the goaltender of the future, but he's a bridge goaltender for now that I think can play well. And with him and Nedeljkovic, you can be competitive and at least provide some stability and remain competitive in this division where there aren't a whole lot of goaltenders, a whole lot of great goaltenders, excluding Andrei Vasilevsky and Sergei Bobrovsky, both playing in, obviously, Florida. So I like those two teams really come to mind. New York, I mentioned Trocheck. Trocheck was a big name on the board. One thing I'm going to point out is I don't know if Nazem Kadri would have went to New York. And again, Nazem Kadri's not signed yet. Maybe New York finds the room to do this. But to me, New York, the power play would have been you sign Nazem Kadri to a 7-year deal, and could you have gotten him at a decent number? Could you got him at $6 million? You had Trocheck at 5.625. Even if you get Kadri at 7 times 7, that's $49 million. But Trocheck's really good. Kadri's older, but Kadri's a better player right now than Vincent Trocheck. He just is. He's a Stanley Cup winner. He's a difference maker. I look at him that way. So I'm not going to look at New York too. I still love New York's roster. I love what they're doing there. They're building. They got their young core. Trocheck replaces Andrew Kopp. They're very similar players. So I think in that sense, it's a very good swap. Ryan Strome is as a UFA. He's still unsigned, so it's likely he's going to move on. So in reality, you really had to fill 2 center slots. They filled one so far with Kopp leaving and obviously Strome leaving, so you filled Trocheck. To me, New York still has to find another center iceman that could come from within. They do have some good prospects. They're bringing over Krasov, who was a first-round pick from a number of years ago, who last played in the KHL. He could be a guy that could be your third-line center next season, and I wouldn't be surprised if they go with him early in the season. New York has the luxury of being a good team, having one of the best goalies in the game. So if a player as a third-line center struggles to begin a season, you can withstand it because you have a good roster, you have one of the best goaltenders, and you can make moves accordingly to get better. But Trocheck comes. I could see them maybe they don't make another move at center. What I do find interesting is this afternoon they traded. They made a trade with Arizona to dump Patrick Nemeth, a defenseman who I talked about during the playoffs as unplayable. Eventually they healthy scratched him. He never saw the ice again. So they move his deal. They move a number of draft picks to get his number off the books. So it frees up some cap space for New York. To me, I haven't read anything online that says they're going to make a push for Nazem Kadri, but that's a baller move. Also, I would free up cap room because despite the fact that Frank Saravalli of Daily Faceoff reported today that Patrick Kane does not want to be moved by the Blackhawks, that he's going to wait to see how the season goes. I can tell you how the season's going to go, Patrick. It's going to go terrible because your team sucks. But he's going to wait at least till mid-season to see how it goes before making any other major moves. I'd be saving up some cap space if I'm New York, saving up some prospects to land Patrick Kane. I've been saying this forever. If you listen to me, this must be like a broken record. But Patrick Kane is just meant to end up in New York. He's a really, really good hockey player. He's still an elite talent. You could retain half the salary to get more in the deal for For Chicago, it's easy who I start with asking. I want Keandre Miller from the back end from New York. That is where the deal starts and stops. If you're not willing to give me Keandre Miller, hang up the phone and don't call me again. He's that good. I think he's a special talent on the back end. And you pair him with Seth Jones, that's a decent start for Chicago, who are going to be absolutely dreadful this year. But that's a starting point. But for New York, it's a good move. You get a Vincent Trocheck. I'd save some cap room so you can at least wait for Patrick Kane to see how bad, when he gets to training camp and he looks around and sees how bad this Chicago team is going to be, he'll look and see Seth Jones, but okay, there's a good player. And then he'll see Max Domi and Andre Athanasiou, who they signed today for 1 year, $3 million each, who are only signed so that they can help get to the cap floor. He'll look around and say, oh my God, we might be picking first in the bleeping draft. So that's what Patrick Kane has to look forward to. I'd be shocked if he's not traded at some point next season, just because I don't see a competitor like Kane accepting such a bad environment when he could have a great opportunity at winning his 4th Stanley Cup in the Big Apple. Some news here. The Seattle Kraken have made a splash. They've signed 2-time Stanley Cup champion Andre Burakovsky to a 5-year contract worth $5.5 million per. Burakovsky is 27 years old, and he had 8 points in 12 playoff games last season. Burakovsky's bounced around during his NHL career. He is a skilled winger who can score goals. He can bring bite when you need him to. It's not a terrible contract for Burakovsky for the Kraken. For Seattle, they need somebody. They need talent to be brought in. They need guys that can score some goals for this team. They were the worst team at scoring goals last year in the entire NHL. And Burakovsky is a name that was out there, and you might have to, 5 times 5, I think would have been fine for Burakovsky. You pay a little bit of an extra tax for a guy that just went off a winning team to go to an expansion club, if you will. But I don't mind Seattle doing this. The other moves today, they signed Martin Jones to come in and be a backup goaltender. Chris Drieger's out for the season with a torn ACL, so they had room to bring in another goaltender alongside Philip Grubauer. So you have they have a decent goalie tandem in Seattle. You have Burakovsky. They also signed Justin Schultz today to a 2-year, $5 million contract. Seattle's definitely not top of mind, but they just drafted Shane Wright. They got Matty Beniers, who's going to be playing in the NHL next year after finishing out his college career at the University of Michigan. So for Seattle next season, it's providing players for their skill guys like Wright, like Beniers to play with. And Burakovsky can fill that role. Beniers are young. They can't be expected to be great right off the hop. Burakovsky's a guy that, again, he's won 2 Stanley Cups and he's 27 years old. He's still a fairly young guy himself, and he's had a ton of success when it comes to winning. So he can find that veteran leadership, be a key person on this team. They lose Giordano, who was the first captain in franchise history, so he's moving out. You still have some good guys in Brandon Tanev and Jamie Alexiak, who have been on championship teams. So you're at least looking at Seattle and saying they have some championship DNA. They have some guys that have been through the wars, so to speak. So Burakovsky is a big name off the board. And I don't mind this move from Seattle because they need some talent. They need guys that, quite frankly, can play. So good move when it comes to this. Other news, the New York Rangers have agreed to terms with goaltender Louis Domingue on a 2-year contract. So Louis Domingue, who played for the Pittsburgh Penguins against the New York Rangers in the playoffs, which is funny, he's agreed to a 2-year deal. New York also signed Yaroslav Halak today. So Louis Domingue could be the goaltender in the American Hockey League. He was on a 2-way contract. It hasn't been announced if it's a 2-way deal. But you're looking at, for New York, they're in a good position because you got Shesterkin. He's a 60-game plus starter. He's a number 1 goalie defined. You don't got to worry about that. So whether it is Halak, who you get for 1.5, that's a flyer contract. Didn't have a great run in Vancouver. I don't love Yaroslav Halak anymore. To me, he's spent. But you get Louis Domingue, who you got some competition in training camp, and you have options to back up Shesterkin, where in all likelihood both whoever wins that backup job will start 20 games this upcoming season and really be a non-factor when it comes to the overall play of the New York Rangers. Other teams today, other than guys keeping their own free agents, because that's so. I mentioned the moves I like. Let's get to moves I didn't really care for. And this one might be a bit polarizing, this take, but to me, it's really not that hard if you know hockey and follow it a little bit. Today, the Carolina Hurricanes traded for defenseman Brent Burns from the San Jose Sharks for Steven Lawrence, who's basically a fourth-line center / right winger, a goaltender prospect, and a third-round pick in the 2024 draft. And San Jose agreed to retain 33% of Brent Burns' remaining contract. And Brent Burns is 37 years old, and he has 3 years remaining on a deal that pays him $8 million a season. So they retain 33% of that $8 million per year in this trade. San Jose is very much they're in the Chicago position where they're very much looking to rebuild, but they have so many bad contracts that it's extremely hard to. They re-signed Tomas Hertl at last year's trade deadline. They still have Erik Karlsson, who is to me is on maybe the worst contract in sports, one of them anyway. People still love him. I don't. I've never been the biggest fan of Erik Karlsson. I never saw Erik Karlsson as a defenseman that was going to win you a Stanley Cup as your best defenseman. But the people voting love him. The Norris Trophy people do. He's not that player anymore. His knees suck, and you got Vlasic on that team. That contract potentially is worse than Erik Karlsson's. You had Burns on the back end. You got Logan Couture make the pot. So it's just a mess. Mike Greer, the new GM, gets Brent Burns off the books. Carolina decides to take him on. So Carolina, as we all know, is one of the cheapest organizations in pro sports. They are so frugal that great talent just leave. They didn't re-sign Trocheck. They didn't re-sign Tony DeAngelo. They just let guys go. They're like, okay, well, it's too bad. We would have liked to keep you, but you're outside our price range. They let people go for nothing. This happens all the time. So what I find so puzzling about this trade is Tony DeAngelo had a career season in Carolina, fit in like a glove, couldn't have competed harder against his former team, the New York Rangers. But instead of, okay, let's re-sign him, he got traded to Philly, signed a 2-year, $10 million deal. So that's $5 million a season. Had over 50 points last year. Pretty good year. And he also had 12 points in 14 playoff games. Again, pretty good. But instead of re-signing a guy that is a decade younger than Brent Burns, they decide to trade for Brent Burns and pay Brent Burns more money. I don't get it. Brent Burns used to be a great player. Brent Burns used to be a Norris Trophy guy, one of the best defensemen in the NHL. And the key word here, when it comes to a lot of these veteran signings today, is used to be. Brent Burns used to be a Norris Trophy defenseman. Brent Burns used to be a difference maker. Brent Burns used to be a stud. Brent Burns is just now a guy with a bad contract, and that's about it. Brent Burns is a fourth-fifth defenseman on a really good team. Well, newsflash, you cannot make $8 million and be the fourth or fifth defenseman on a team. You need to be better than that. But Brent Burns, who's beat to hell, Brent Burns, who is 37, and Brent Burns, who's joining a Carolina Hurricanes team where he'll be asked to do a lot, because other than Jacob Slavin, my boy, and Brett Pesce, he slides in as number 3. He slides in as their number 3 defenseman because Tony DeAngelo is gone. Ethan Bear has asked for a trade. Brendan Smith signed with the New Jersey Devils. They are losing defensemen as we speak, meaning Brent Burns is going to be asked to be a big contributor in Carolina. Just because it's a big name in a trade doesn't mean it's a good trade. Doesn't mean that it's a winner. The Matt Murray trade was hit with just ultimate negativity. All I've seen today is the positivity around Brent Burns. And I get it. Brent Burns is in the Kit Kat commercials. Brent Burns is no teeth. He collects snakes, tattoos. Hey, I get it. I got a few. Who doesn't like Brent Burns? But I don't care about the perception. I care about what you deliver on the ice. To me, this is a bad trade because you could have had Tony DeAngelo. You could have signed him to a long-term extension. You could have continued to get better. But instead of keeping Vincent Trocheck for $5.625, and instead of keeping DeAngelo for $5 million, because that's what he signed for in Philly, the fact that you signed for $5 in Philly, not signed for $5 in Carolina makes zero sense to me. And until somebody reports that DeAngelo wouldn't have stayed in Carolina, he was completely against it, I won't back off this opinion. I don't understand getting Brent Burns. You'd rather play Brent Burns over $6 million and instead let two of your key players walk out the door? Carolina decided to change their entire goaltending tandem after last season. It worked out to a point. They got to the second round. They didn't get any farther. They make a big splash trading for Brent Burns. He's noteworthy. He'll likely put asses in seats. He leaves San Jose after 11 years. But does this get them any closer to winning a Stanley Cup? It doesn't. I'm sorry to every Brent Burns fan out there, but it just doesn't. He's a really good guy. He's a good player. But this is just shrewd work by Mike Grier. Retaining 33%, you didn't have to retain 50%. You got him off your books. You needed to. You can't trade Vlasic. Vlasic is an untradeable contract. To me, Erik Karlsson's is an untradeable contract because nobody wants him anymore. The Ottawa Senators wouldn't take him back. I told this to a friend the other day. Ottawa Senators don't want Erik Karlsson back. San Jose is a bunch of guys that nobody wants, and Carolina was stupid enough to take one. Normally, I think Carolina is one of the shrewdest operations in the NHL. Today, it's not one of those times. You got an old defenseman, you got a goalie that quits come playoff time, and you got a forward group that still remains not enough. Sebastian Aho is a great player. Svechnikov's a very good player, despite the playoff run. Niederreiter's unsigned. You might lose. So you could lose Niederreiter, Trocheck, and DeAngelo in an offseason, and you gain Brent Burns. That is an absolute tire fire. That is hell on wheels. That's a shit show. If this was the Toronto Maple Leafs, people would be burning the fucking cross. But it's Carolina that nobody cares about, so I got to talk about it. I got to be bad guy to Brent Burns. But think of that. You lose Niederreiter, Trocheck, DeAngelo, and you get Brent Burns. That's the trade-off. 3 for 1. If this was a decade ago, okay, I'll rationalize with you. He's 37. 37, you still have to pay him over $6 million a season. That's not a good trade-off. That's lunacy. That's your offseason. We are so fucking cheap that we're not going to pay these three guys, but we'll pay the fucking old man Withers this amount of money to come play. Makes no sense to me. Absolute no sense. But hey, good for Carolina. You got a competitive team that a lot of guys are in their prime, and it's going to be completely wasted because you're making stupid decisions with your money. Oh, one side of your mouth, you're too cheap to be competitive, to push all in, to really, just to even frame this even more, they are unwilling to spend big money on Trocheck, on DeAngelo, on Niederreiter, but they're willing to spend big money on Brent Burns and Jesperi Kotkaniemi. Really think about it. They paid Kotkaniemi $6.1 million last year to be a fourth-line center. They're going to pay him over $4 million the next 8 years to be a fourth-line center because his offensive game is fucking irrelevant. You're trading away these pieces for Burns and Kotkaniemi. That's your trade-off. I feel bad for Brendan Moore. I think he's a great coach, but he's not going to have enough to get over the hump in Carolina. Because your goaltending's still a mess. Because you got a guy that just gets hurt or quits every playoff year, and then you got a stud in Jacob Slavin, who I love more than anyone. But you got an old man in Pesci. Hopefully Brent Burns can find some success. But if you really think about what I'm saying, push past the love, push past the Brent Burns Kit Kat, fit it in the no teeth commercial, which is fine. It's an okay commercial. It's not that great. But push past that, push past the love for him, and really think about what I'm saying. The trade-off that the Carolina Hurricanes made, and you'll realize, wow, Noah's actually speaking some truth right now about the shit situation that they're in. Hated that move for Carolina today. Another move, Vancouver. Yikes. Vancouver Canucks today did some puzzling moves. Really puzzling. And normally I think, well, Vancouver, they got Jimmy Rutherford. Jim Benning is gone. It's a new start. The free agent market, they won't do what they used to do. Well, they're making similar moves. And I'm looking around saying, Patrick Alvan, the new GM, but Rutherford's really running the show there. What's happening? So Vancouver today makes their two main moves were Vancouver signed Ilya Mikheyev, the former Toronto Maple Leaf, to a 4-year contract worth $19 million. So that's 4.75 per. And Dan Milstein, the agent of Mikheyev, said he wanted between 4.75 to 5.75. So he got the 4.75. So he accomplished his goal. He got rated close to $5 million. And his client gets to go to Vancouver, and all that money's guaranteed over the next 4 years. So he did his job as an agent. So they make that move. And then they signed Curtis Lazar to a 3-year deal worth $3 million. So let's break these down. Ilya Mikheyev had 21 goals last year and 32 points. That means 12 assists. He's almost like Cy Young. He can only do one thing. But he had one season where Mikheyev was a great goal scorer, and it's not lost on me that one great season was in a contract year. But before last season, Mikheyev had not proven that he had any hands whatsoever. He had proven that he could get 3 breakaways a game and not score on 3 of them. He would shoot the puck right in the middle of the goalie's crest, and they'd blow the whistle, play would go on. He does have great speed. He will play with some tenacity. There's elements of Ilya Mikheyev's game that I really like. To me, he's a solid player. I think he's more of a bottom 6 forward than a top 6. He's not a bad player. That's not what I'm saying. Any of these players today aren't bad players, but there are bad contracts. And that's just point blank. That's sports. To me, Mikheyev is a $2.5 million guy. He's an important piece on a good team. He can play on your third line. He can kill penalties. He can be on a checking line. That's where I see him. But Vancouver gives him 4.75. You give a guy a 4.75 million, he's playing on your second line. And he's playing big minutes, and you expect him to be a 20-goal scorer. You expect him to be a consistent 20-goal scorer and have a major impact on your team. If I had to bet next year on whether Ilya Mikheyev scores 20 goals or 10, I'll take 10. And I'll even put it this way. I might bet this on FanDuel because I'm sure I can find the bet, and FanDuel's my site, so I'll make sure maybe they'll hear me and they'll put this bet in. If I don't know what the over-under is going to be for Ilya Mikheyev goals next season, but I'll even set it myself. If it's 20, I'll set it at 20. I'll go under. You know what I'll even do? Ilya Mikheyev goals next season, I'll put it at 14.5 and I'll go under. I'm putting that bet in right now. It's on the podcast. I said it. There's a best bet. Ilya Mikheyev under 14.5 goals next season. Under. Because I don't think he's going to live up to the contract. He got his deal. He's out of Toronto. He's happy. Great. How many times have we seen this? How many times that a guy had a contract, just a great year in his contract season, and it doesn't pay off? He ends up being a wash somewhere else, and the teams look around going, well, that's not what we bought. So when you go and you buy a TV, you come home, you get it out of the box, it's cracked as shit. You're like, well, that's not what I bought. Well, that's what you got. And you didn't keep your receipt, so you're fucked. You can't give it back. Toronto's not taking Mikheyev's back because they can't afford him. So you're stuck with Ilya Mikheyev, but to me, he will be under 14.5 goals next season. FanDuel right now, book it. That's my bet. I'm going to put in after the show that he's going to have under 14.5 goals because as much as I like him as a player, I don't hate any player. But I don't understand why he needed to get this big a deal. To me, this is Vancouver being, again, stupid. They're shopping JT Miller, who's a really good player, but heading to unrestricted free agency after next season. They're likely not going to re-sign him because he wants too much money. But yet you give Mikheyev close to $5 million. Well, he's 27. Again, he's in the prime of his career. But if you're trading JT Miller, your team's going to be worse. You're not going to get great players back. So that means that one season you're likely going to miss the playoffs. There's a wash. Then you have 3 years left where each season I think Mikheyev will likely get worse. So again, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But good for Vancouver. They took their chance with him. He stays in Canada. But I don't understand it. Then there's the Curtis Lazar signing. Curtis Lazar's had a funny career. He's bounced around Buffalo, Calgary. He's been everywhere. Was projected to be a really Ottawa. Was projected to be a solid NHL player. And played at the World Juniors, was a captain there, and his career didn't go as a top-line player. He's bounced around as a fourth-line guy. I do think he played well in Boston last year, quite frankly. He filled a role. He played every playoff game. I like the fact that he has found his niche. He's bought into it. So credit to Curtis Lazar because a lot of guys are exiting the league when you were a top-notch player, when you had high expectations, and you can't pivot. He pivoted, so I'll give him enough credit for that. Good for him for finding the ability to do that. But I look at his deal, 3 years, $3 million. It's not a whole lot of money. I get it. It's $1 million per season. But in the past, what would Vancouver do? They'd sign guys to 3 to 4 year deals that you knew were fourth line centers, that you knew that they had no more capability. You go back through their history and they just signed so many guys that you knew weren't going to be great. Antoine Roussel comes to mind right off the bat. He was given a 4-year contract. The guy they signed from Washington, his name's I can't remember his name right now. He won a cup there, and then the next season he's on a 4-year deal with Vancouver. They love to give these bottom depth pieces long-term contracts. Who is offering Curtis Lazar more than a 1-year deal? Who are you bidding with for Curtis Lazar? The guy is a 10 to 15 point player, and that's his cap. He brings nothing offensively to the table. He's a chip-in fourth line center, but he gets $1 million a year for 3 years. He's ecstatic about this contract. To me, I don't understand the 3 years of it. And I'm sure the argument will be it's $1 million. You can get rid of it in a second, but it's another contract you have. The cap's not moving up a whole bunch. This isn't the NBA where they have a TV deal coming up where guys are going to be making major amounts of money and the cap's going to rise. There's no guarantee that the cap is jumping in the NHL. It's a hard cap. These contracts, when Vancouver is finally ready to be competitive, ready to be a good team, some of this money gets in the way. The Mikheyev deal, the Lazar one can hurt your team when you ultimately want to try to bring in a piece, and then you have to offload a piece to get in the piece that you wanted. But in order to get the piece you wanted, you had to move out the bad pieces. And with moving out the bad pieces, you move out assets, and your team's worse. It's convoluted, but that's the way it works. I don't understand it. Why 3 years for Curtis Lazar? And I'm sorry, just because you're a good guy doesn't mean you deserve a big contract. Just because, Curse Lazar is a good cat. He's a good kid. I don't care. I don't care. That doesn't matter to me at all. Other news pouring in here is like before we get onto other teams. Mark Stahl is signing in Florida on a 1-year deal for $750,000. Eric Stahl is signing with Florida on a PTO, so a pro tryout offer. So he'll go to training camp next season with Florida and with his brother Mark Stahl. And they, oddly enough, these two have never. Mark has never played with any of his brothers. Jordan and Eric played together in Carolina, but now you got Mark Stahl and Eric Stahl paired together, possibly for Florida. They've been quiet today, but Florida gets Mark Stahl on a cheap deal. So Mark Stahl is headed to Florida. So a good little piece of business. You get the Stahl brothers brought in, and Eric obviously played at the Olympics. He's hoping he's got one more kick at the can to see if he can be competitive moving forward. The Pittsburgh Penguins made another move, and I'll get back to them early. They signed defenseman Jan Ruda to a 3-year contract worth $8.25 million. Ruda has been on the Tampa Bay Lightning for the last number of years. He's been paired with Victor Hedman a ton. He's a guy that can play. I think he's a 5th, 6th defenseman, but 3 years at 2.75. I don't mind that deal for Pittsburgh. He's played in big moments. He's played in Stanley Cup Finals, and he's going to a team that obviously wants to be competitive going into next season. So Jan Ruda is not guy to add. Florida also added Nick Cousins. So he's agreed to a 2-year deal, times $1.1 million. He's bounced around, played in Nashville, played in Seattle, played in Philly. But Nick Cousins he's a 4th-line center. He provides some depth for Florida, and he'll likely be competing with Eric Stahl for some minutes, although Eric will likely be pivoting to the wing moving forward. Let's get to another big part of today, and that's obviously goaltending, and that'll lead us to the Washington Capitals. Washington Capitals made a couple of big moves today in net. It started with they got the biggest piece off the board, and that would be Darcy Kuemper. Washington signed Darcy Kuemper to a 5-year deal worth $26.25 million, $5.25 million per season. I thought Darcy Kuemper would be getting more money than this, quite frankly. He was the biggest name off the board. He just came off winning a Stanley Cup. But I guess the trade-off is that he gets 5 years, so he gets a long-term extension with Washington. And to me, Washington, they traded Vanacek. They let Samsonov walk, and they clearly had a plan, Brian McClellan did, to bring in new goaltending. They knew they had money with Backstrom on long-term IR that could make stuff happen, and Kuemper is now their new goalie. They've gone through Holtby, they've gone through Samsonov, they've gone through Vanacek. Kuemper's a very good goalie. To me, you need a solid tandem with him. Again, he couldn't play all playoffs last year as he got injured. So he's a guy that he's proven that he can win. You know that about him. And Washington's in a win now mode. They're very much, let's see if we can do it. To me, they're still in the mix to try to sign Nazem Kadri, who remains unsigned. But I like the Darcy Kuemper addition. For Washington had to do this because Jack Campbell was going to Edmonton. That was just a lock signing. And Washington really had no choice but to jump on Darcy Kuemper. After Toronto said, we aren't interested in Kuemper, we're going to trade for Matt Murray. Washington was just the easy linkage. And it even became more and more clear after Ottawa decided to trade for Cam Talbot. There's only so many goalies to go around, in particular starters. So Washington saw their guy, they locked in on him, and they got the deal done. So Alex Ovechkin's still in Washington. You still have Kuznetsov. Oshie is still kicking around there. They got a solid team. I don't love Washington's one of the biggest problems for me in Washington is their defense core. Justin Schultz is gone. He's in Seattle. I do think they need to make some moves on the back end. It's not a great defensive market. Maybe there's some trades to be made for the Washington Capitals. I like their goaltending. I like Kuemper. I don't love him. But to me, for Washington to have success, for them to legitimately say we're Stanley Cup contenders, they need to improve the defense core so it's not entirely on Darcy Kuemper to be a rock star, to be the saving grace, time and time again for this team. So I look at Washington, at Brian McClellan, who did some good work today to help Darcy Kemper when it comes to putting guys in front of him that aren't giving up high-quality scoring chances game in and game out. You have some stable building blocks. You got John Carlson, who's still in the prime of his career, is still a very good defenseman, but you can add some good pieces to help him as well. Washington also signed a backup goalie, just announced Frank Saravelli, that the Washington Capitals have signed goaltender Charlie Lindgren to a 3-year, $3.3 million contract. This is so interesting because Charlie Lindgren has played 5 NHL games. I mentioned him yesterday as a guy I thought St. Louis would keep and play as their backup goalie because they know him extremely well. He's played for their AHL club the last number of seasons. He was originally drafted by the Montreal Canadiens. He was a goalie that went through the system, that battled through. It was there when Price was there. He was ultimately moved. Never really got a chance at the backup job, and he was also there with Zach Fucale. He ends up on St. Louis. Their Springfield goes on a run to the Calder Cup final last year. They ultimately lose to Charlotte, but Charlie Lindgren was the starting goalie, and he now parlays a great American Hockey League season into a 3-year NHL deal. 3-year one-way deal for Charlie Lindgren. Good for him, but it also just tells us how weak the goaltending market is, that a guy with 5 NHL starts to his name is getting a 3-year, $3.3 million, so $1.1 million a year for a guy that has hardly played in the National Hockey League. He's now the backup to Darcy Kemper. So another curious thing for me is Calvin Pickard was signed as a third goaltender today behind Jack Campbell and Stuart Skinner in Edmonton. Does Washington get interest on Zach Fucale, who is still in Hershey? He's a good guy to have as a third goaltender. Maybe they won't want to move him, but I could see some teams making a few calls on him because he's got about as much NHL experience as Charlie Lindgren, and you could see him being a guy that could be a fit. So just an interesting day for goaltenders. Halak gets another deal. I didn't see that happening. I thought his career was done. Charlie Lindgren gets a 3-year, $3.3 million deal. Martin Jones gets recycled again in Seattle. I mean, you go through these teams. A lot of teams are just taking goaltenders, hoping to find something. But good for Charlie Lindgren. I have nothing against him. He's battled through. He's played in the American League a long, long time. But he gets a big ticket, and he gets off the board. Elliot Friedman says Justin Braun and Nick Deslauriers are going to Philadelphia. Justin Braun was in Philly and then was traded at last year's trade deadline. So he's going back to Philadelphia, and Nick Deslauriers is a tough physical winger who's with Minnesota and formerly of Anaheim. Also, Eric Goodbranson, the former Calgary Flame, former number 4 overall pick back in the day in the draft, signs a 4-year deal worth $4 million per in Columbus. So Columbus adds to their defense core, and Eric Goodbranson is in Columbus. So I've talked about a lot of teams. I realize I'm bouncing around. I've been talking about deals I like, deals I don't like. When it comes to today, there's still a lot of guys that are unsigned. Johnny Gaudreau, Nazem Kadri, Andre Palat, Paul Stastny, as Darren Dreger just tweets. Just watch the segment on TSN. Paul Stastny continues to mull over his options. No rush to make a decision yet. Wouldn't surprise me if he's not a guy that signs a contract today. It might be tomorrow. It could be the weekend. He's a veteran. I think he'll want to sign in a location that's obviously good for his family, but also a spot where he can win a Stanley Cup. I think that's the main thing for him is just to see where he can go, where he can win games, where he can compete for a Stanley Cup. Because he's had a long career. He just saw his former teammates in Colorado win a Stanley Cup. A guy like Eric Johnson, who he's extremely close to. Maybe he'll want to pair with them and see what they can do. So curious to see what happens. But Paul Stastny is a veteran. I wouldn't pay a whole lot for him, but he would be a good guy to add to your team if you're looking to compete for a Stanley Cup. I've gone an hour into this podcast, if you can believe it, and I haven't talked about the Toronto Maple Leafs or the Edmonton Oilers, which I'm kind of proud of myself about. I take pride in that because there's a lot happening. And I think, but let's get to these teams. Let's start in Toronto because Toronto had a good day, in my opinion. The Matt Murray trade is still polarizing. To me, people hating the trade, people loving the trade. That's going to happen until October. Matt Murray will have the season to prove people wrong. And if he's fantastic, he can give a middle finger to every Leaf fan out there and tell them to suck it because nobody had any faith in him, and he'll be justified doing that. So good for Matt Murray if he finds some success. For me, it's just wait and see. But Toronto made the moves they had to make today in my mind. Toronto went out there and they signed Ilya Samsonov, who is formerly of the Washington Capitals, so they declined his qualifying offer. Toronto signed to a one-year deal worth $1.8 million today. This is a good piece of business for the Toronto Maple Leafs because Samsonov is 25. He's got some holes in his game. He's clearly got some problems because Washington didn't want him back. They'd prefer a backup goaltender obviously in Charlie Lindgren, who it's played 5 NHL games over Ilya Samsonov. But Toronto picks him up. He's got talent. He's young. And hasn't had a long injury history. And Toronto needed a guy behind Matt Murray who they know could play NHL hockey. You couldn't have a Jerry Shalgren. You can't have Joseph Wall, who are AHL starters, behind Matt Murray. Because Matt Murray, I mean, we've detailed it the last number of days. Matt Murray is an infirmary. He's always in the medical room. He's always got something taped up. He's always got something wrong with him, or he's flaking out and just doesn't want to play hockey. So Samsonov is a guy Toronto needed to add. Is he a lock great goaltender this year? Absolutely not. But to me, looking at what was available, and that's sometimes what you have to do and say, what could we get? It's a good decision. Lindgren is a risk with Washington. The 3 years is crazy to me. I wouldn't have given him 3 years, but this just tells you how the market is. You need to give a guy like that 3 years, but nevertheless, to me, Lindgren, his agent deserves just a huge raise and just a pat on the back for giving a guy like Charlie Lindgren a 3-year contract. So kudos to him. But Samsonov comes to Toronto, has a chance to rejuvenize his career, to prove people that he deserves a longer-term contract. And this has worked for a number of guys. Mikheyev signed from the KHL. He just got a 4-year deal. Players move on and have some success. Zach Hyman got a 7-year contract as a guy that didn't have a whole lot of pedigree coming into Toronto, signing as a college free agent. So there are players that use Toronto as a launching pad to get to better situations, to get bigger contracts. Occasionally, it can go horrible for you. It can just be the end of you. It can, for Garrett Sparks, it marked really the end of his career. He still plays in the American League and some on the East Coast, but that NHL opportunity was really his last, and he never got another one. So for Samsonov, it's an opportunity for him where he signs with the team, and for me, for him signing, he knows he may have an opportunity at some point to be the starting goalie. I actually have more faith in Samsonov being great next year than Matt Murray. To me, it would not shock me one bit to see Samsonov be the starting goaltender for the Toronto Maple Leafs come the start of the Stanley Cup playoffs next year. To me, I think he can find it in his game. And maybe Matt Murray's great, but maybe he's also, grabbing his knee and he's got problems. Samsonov is a guy I could see being their starting goalie come the end of next season. So I like that move for Toronto. With what was available, they made the right moves that they had to. For Toronto, they also picked up fourth line depth piece Nicholas Aube-Kubel on a 1-year, $1 million contract. Aube-Kubel has bounced around. He played in Philly. He was recently with Colorado, where he played in a few playoff games. He was a healthy scratch during the Game 6. But Aube-Kubel is a good depth piece. He's a fourth line guy. Fourth line guy, but for $1 million, I think they're going to find really good value in Aube-Kubel. He is a fast skater. He's not the most physical guy. I still think they needed somebody that adds a little girth to this fourth line, that adds a little bite. Seamus brought up Zach McEwen yesterday. He remains unsigned, so he could be a guy that Toronto brings in for cheap. But Aubé-Kubel for $1 million, it's a good buy to me. It's zero risk. It's a flyer. You put him on your fourth line. You're not expecting your fourth liners to be world beaters. But to me, Aubé-Kubel is a smart guy, is a smart little player. He's got speed. He's got tenacity. And I think he'll be driven to come in and compete well with the Toronto Maple Leafs. So I like the signing of him. I like the Samsonov signing. When you don't have a whole lot of money, you got to make do with what you have. And for me, I look at Toronto and say, I like Samsonov. It's very low money, and it's potentially high upside. Aubé-Kubel, it's 1 year, $1 million. I think you'll get $1 million worth of value from him this upcoming season. So I also think that's a very good signing for the Toronto Maple Leafs. So Matt Murray put aside, because that was a couple days ago. Today, Wednesday, July 13th, this was a good work day for the Maple Leafs where they made some smart decisions. They don't have a whole lot of money, but they worked with what they had, and I think they come out of it with a pretty damn good day. So good on Kyle Dubas and the nerds with the Maple Leafs. Now to Edmonton. I think Edmonton had a pretty good day, and again, it starts in net. They get their guy, Jack Campbell, on a 5-year deal worth $5 million. It's very similar to Darcy Kemper. What I do find surprising is that Kemper is making 5.25. Campbell's making $5 million a year. So they're almost similar, and Campbell's been a starter for half a season. Kemper's been a starting goaltender in Arizona for a long period of time, was a successful one. So I find it a little surprising that Kemper clearly had one team in mind. It was Washington. And after he said he wasn't going to go back to Colorado, that was it for him. That was the market, and he had to settle for what was available. And I might lose my bet with Seamus about John Klingberg, because John Klingberg reportedly is now negotiating again with the Dallas Stars because there's not that much available for him. I thought he'd get $9 million in the open market, but maybe teams are starting to be smarter than I think they are. So Jack Campbell, 5 years, $5 million. I heard the TSN crew talk about this today, and I agree with them. Stuart Skinner is the important piece here, because Jack Campbell, he's not a 55-game starter. He hasn't proved that he is. He's hurt all the time as well. But Stuart Skinner is a guy that can play games next season, can play as your backup goaltender in Edmonton and have some success doing that. So Campbell, and you got Stuart Skinner. They also signed Calvin Pickard to be the third goaltender in the American Hockey League to play in Bakersfield. So you need to take a chance in somebody. And again, the goalie market was so small. It was so razor thin that they clearly like Jack Campbell. I don't love giving him 5 years. I don't love giving him $5 million, but Edmonton believes that they can win a championship now, and they had to pick a goalie. They go with him, and they got to hope that Mike Smith goes on long-term IR so that his money goes away and he's not even a part of the program next year. You can bring in a rookie starter to be your backup goaltender and see what he can do, and see if he can have some success. So I don't love it, but you had to do it. So it is what it is. Edmonton also re-signed Evander Kane to a 4-year deal worth $20.5 million. To me, again, Evander Kane is always a risk because you never know what this guy is going to do. But he had all kinds of success in Edmonton. He plays great with Connor McDavid. And I'll put it this way. I think the deal is a win for Edmonton because when it comes to the market and what he gives you on the ice when he's playing at his best and he's mentally there, this is a steal. He's a great player. He's one of the best power forwards in the game. He's got slick hands in front of the net. Evander Kane is a great, great talent. And to get him at just, at a little over $5 million a year, that's a really good contract. And I also think it's a win that it's 4 years. It's not 5. It's not 6. So I look that as a big win by Ken Holland. He signed some contracts I don't like, but you got Zach Hyman got 7 years. You got Evander Kane at 4. That, to me, just not being 5 years is a major win and a good business by Ken Holland, because it can be a steal of a contract as early as November of next year if Evander Kane keeps it on the straight and narrow. If Connor McDavid and that team is playing extremely well, and he's not doing stupid crap. That's the main thing. Half the job here is making sure that Evander Kane is not being an idiot, that Evander Kane doesn't do stupid shit, that he's not off the rails. That is half the job for the Edmonton Oilers. Ken Holland and the coaching staff are going to have some sleepless nights thinking, what's this guy doing? Are we going to wake up to a call that he's doing something stupid? The major thing might be this summer to see if he does some stupid crap prior to the season. So there is that risk, there is that worry with Evander Kane, but he is a great player when he's on his A game. He was great in San Jose early on, and he can be a big reason why Edmonton continues to push and ultimately wins a Stanley Cup in the not too distant future. So I like those two, and they re-signed Brett Kulak to a 4-year deal worth $11 million. Brett Kulak's not my favorite player. Brett Kulak is not a difference maker on the back end. He's a 5'6" defenseman. Clearly they like him. It's not a whole lot of money, so I'm not going to criticize the deal that much. But to me, the biggest thing holding back the Edmonton Oilers is the fact that their defense is not good enough. Yes, you got Broberg. Yes, you have your young D pushing up, Evan Bouchard, who is, again, not my favorite player in the NHL. You need some defensemen that have experience that can play in the big moments. They miss out on Josh Manson today, and I'll get to Colorado in a minute and the day that they had, which I think was superb. So you're missing out on those type opportunities. So Kulak's nice to bring back, but they needed to make a splash, and they didn't get Leddy, who I thought would have been a great fit. He goes back to St. Louis on a 4-year, 4x4, which is a perfect contract for him, perfect contract for the team. I love that one. So it's a good day for Edmonton, for sure. They're more competitive now. They got a better chance of winning a Stanley Cup next year with the moves that they've made over the last 24 hours. No doubt about it. But I also look and say, hey, yes, those are solid moves. You're happy with that. You're excited to see it, but you also need to add, to me, it's adding another big piece on the back end. Darnell Nurse healthy is a top 5-7 defenseman in the National Hockey League. He was injured in the playoffs, and it was so obvious that he was injured. And the people that notice, okay, he's injured, maybe he's not playing well because of his injury, thank you. So I'm not the only one here. Shout out to my friend Nick Gilbert, who texted me about it during the playoffs, and he was rational with me about it, other than people that text me and killed him. So shout out to my good buddy Nick. But Edmonton needs another piece on the back for me to really look at this team and say, hey, you can make something work. Will the Islanders part with Mayfield? Would they part with Pollock? Would they part with any of their big guys in the back end? That's something I would look into if I'm Edmonton, because you need another really good defender on that back end for me to say, okay, Edmonton is really, they can compete with Colorado. They compete with some of these great teams in the Western Conference and go to a Stanley Cup final. So good days for, I think, Ottawa had a solid day, solid couple weeks here. I think Edmonton had Edmonton's can go to shit real quick because of the goaltending situation, but they did what they had to do. A lot of these teams that made moves with goaltenders, I can't kill them about it because you can only get what's available. So again, look at it that way. Toronto, I think, had a solid day as well with what they could do. Now, could they have traded William Nylander and been more aggressive? Yeah. You could have been more. I will pin that on them and say you weren't aggressive enough. You're unwilling to. You look at your roster and say we could get better if we lose this piece, but they're not going to do that. I'm not going to expecting. I'm done looking at teams saying you should. I expect you should do this. You get better, and expecting that team to do it, because that's just stupidity on my end, and I'm wasting my breath, because if they don't want to be better, I'm not going to help them. Toronto's done nothing for me. So, more breaking news here. Detroit Red Wings continue to be aggressive. They Andrew Kopp. They got Ville Husso. They got Ben Sherratt today, and they've signed David Perron to a 2-year deal worth $9.5 million. This is interesting. A little over $4.5 million a season for David Perron. He's bounced around. He's had some success in when he went to Vegas in the expansion draft. He's had a career where in St. Louis, David Perron is awesome. He's a difference maker. He's a great playoff guy. And he had 7 goals in the postseason last year for St. Louis in their 2 rounds of play till they ultimately fell to the Colorado Avalanche. So he's a great player. I like David Perron a lot. I like this move. I'm just going to put it this way. First, Detroit's being aggressive today. They're spending money. You look at them, they're not comfortable with just staying a porous team by doing nothing to get better. I like what they're doing here. You add a good player in Kopp. You add Perron, who's won a Stanley Cup, who's a champion, who's been through the wars, to add to this young core. You've added Ben Sherratt, who's been through the wars, and you get a goaltender that can play. So kudos to Detroit today. Detroit, Ottawa, these teams that are tired of being bad. I'd much rather add an Andrew Kopp and a David Perron and a Sherratt and a Husso than go all out like I think New Jersey is going to do and sign Johnny Gaudreau. I'd add those 4 pieces instead of getting one. And okay, Perron, you're spending more money, likely $10 million more, but you're getting more pieces that can help you rather than one winger who's going to take up a large chunk of your cap. So David Perron is a really, I like that addition a lot for Detroit. Like I said, Kopp, Perron, I'm writing them all down here just to remember, Sherratt and Husso during this UFA period. That is that's very good business by Stevie Yzerman. I'm not surprised. That's what Steve Yzerman does. But he was still out there. They bring him into Detroit. And like I said, I expect them to be a team that is good next season. They still have a lot of learning to do. I don't know if Dylan Larkin can be the best player on a championship team, but I think Mo Seider can be on the back end. I think they got their number 1 defenseman. And to me, it's more important to have a number 1 defenseman than it is to have a number 1 center. They got that. Mo Seider's legit. He's the real deal. He's a stud. I take him all day, every day, and twice on Sunday. So good for them. Panthers have added former Ottawa Senators forward Colin White. So Colin White gets a 1-year deal in Florida. So he just got bought out. He gets to try to find some success there. Noah Chari has found success down there. Mason Marchment had a career resurgence. He turned that into a 4-year deal in Dallas today. Good for him. Mason, obviously, I like him a lot. He was a former Leafs draft pick. Went to Florida, had some success, and terrible. He lost his father last week, or right before the draft, Brian, the former NHLer, but he gets a 4-year, $18 million deal to go to Dallas. And the Panthers also signed goaltender Alex Lyon, who was the starting goaltender for the Charlotte Checkers in the American Hockey League. So there's another goalie. He'll likely be the 3rd goaltender in Florida, but again, he's a guy that could push through. He could be a guy you trade for come the start of the season if you're looking for some goaltending depth and a guy that can win you some hockey games. So again, a lot of good moves today. But 2 teams that I find incredibly compelling, and I can talk about, obviously I'm going to talk about this all week, is Kadri, Gaudreau. These guys still aren't signed. What's even more interesting is that the Toronto Blue Jays fired Charlie Montoyo today during the middle of free agency. That's not lost on me. It was really a news dump during the middle of the signings, and I'm going to get more into that tomorrow, but the fact that they fire him after they get a win last night, that they didn't fire him on their day off on a Monday, is surprising to me. This is all really weird. I want to hear more about it. Maybe they don't want to get things to go worse, but again, I'll talk about that more tomorrow when there's less hockey news. Oh, and Detroit has also added Dominik Kubalik, who's playing with Chicago Blackhawks, former 30-goal scorer. So they've added 5 players. They had Dominik Kubalik, who they didn't qualify to a 2-year deal. They had Kopp, Perron, Sherratt, Husso. So they're aggressive moves by this team today. So kudos to them for a really, really good deal. And Kubalik is signing a contract worth $3.7 million over 2 years to go to Detroit. But nice. And they also signed Marco Kasper to his 3-year entry-level contract today. Oh, and Detroit has added defenseman Ollie Mata on a 1-year, $2.25 million deal. So Detroit is really adding to their roster, and kudos to them for becoming a competitive team in short order here. Okay, now let's get to two teams that were really interesting today, but it's interesting because they didn't do much. And that would be the Tampa Bay Lightning and the Colorado Avalanche. Of these two teams, they added one player today. Tampa Bay Lightning signed Ian Cole to a 1-year, $3 million deal. Ian Cole, who was with Carolina, another player Carolina lost today. He's played for Pittsburgh. He's won 2 Stanley Cups. He's had a ton of success in his career. So he goes to Tampa. He's going to fill in to replace basically Jan Ruda, and he'll be in that defense core where they got Sergachev, they have Hedman, you got Chernak, you got Philip Myers there now, you have Cal Foote. They got a number of guys that are going to be competing. That's going to be a tough locker room to crack going into next season, but it's more depth for the Tampa Bay Lightning. But other than that one player, the two teams that were in the Stanley Cup final did not add anybody new. Tampa is going to lose Andre Palat. That hurts. They lost Ryan McDonough. That hurts. They're losing players left and right. Colorado is going to lose Nazem Kadri. They lost Darcy Kemper. So these teams that go far, they are penalized. That's with the hard cap. That's the way it works. The best teams are penalized and you lose players off your roster, which makes it inherently more difficult for you to win Stanley Cups. But I look at these two teams today and the business they did, and it's incredibly impressive. Colorado, let's start with them, the defending champions. Colorado today re-signed Josh Manson to a 4-year, $18 million deal. That's $4.5 million on an annual and average annual value. The fact that they could bring back Josh Manson with their salary cap situation, and after they just won a cup, and it's so hard to bring guys back, is so impressive to me. Manson, to me, has been one of the most coveted guys in the NHL last number of years. Teams wouldn't trade for him. I didn't understand it. I said forever, people in my life that love the Maple Leafs, I said, trade for Josh Manson. But, of course, Toronto wouldn't do that because they're Toronto, and he's got too much girth. He's too strong. He's not fast enough. He's got all these problems, Josh Manson. And there are games where Josh Manson is out to lunch. He plays horrible. And guess what? I criticized him during the playoffs. But he is better than your average just defenseman that is laboring, that sits back, that chips the puck off the glass. He skates extremely well, and he's got better offensive instincts. He's just a good damn player. But you get him at $4.5 million on a 4-year term. He's 27 years old. That's a good contract. I like Josh Manson a ton. Colorado clearly seems like he's a fit. He played extremely well with Bowen Byram. I keep him on that pair. So you get Bowen Byram, your surging defenseman who only continues to get better. You keep his defense partner in town. That seems like a good piece of business. So that's check mark number 1 for the Colorado Avalanche. Then you re-sign Darren Helm and Andrew Cogliano, your 2 veterans who played in the 4th line, to 1-year deals with $1.25 million apiece. These aren't game breakers, but Helm's a multiple-time winner. Cogliano won his first cup, but he's been in the league forever. He's been on competitive teams, and it's just continuity. These guys were there last year. They won cups, and they fit. Again, Cogliano was a trade deadline acquisition. Josh Manson was a trade deadline acquisition. They loved it so much, they decided to stay. And then Arturi Lehkonen, who was traded from Montreal, and he plays great at times. Signed a 5-year, $22.5 million extension, again, worth $4.5 million. Lehkonen's not worth $5 million. Maybe you want him at $4 million, but to me, he won a cup. He's got 3 series-clinching goals. You have to pay a tax for guys that have proved it. Lehkonen's a good player. He's done a lot of good stuff in his career. I applaud them for re-signing these four guys. Okay, you don't have the money to add a lot of big names in free agency. Okay, you don't have the money to go surging, to do a lot of massive things. But what you do is you've added pieces to your team. You've kept pieces that won you a Stanley Cup on your roster. Your trade deadline acquisitions were so great, and you realized it, and you kept them all. I give a ton of credit to Colorado for keeping these guys in-house. Lehkonen would have been coveted. Josh Manson. I mentioned the defense market. It's not large. I haven't mentioned a whole lot of great defensemen signing today. It's all forwards. John Klingberg's still available, but other than that, it's a weak defensive market. Brendan Smith got signed today. I can go through the signings. I like Nick Leddy a lot. Justin Schultz, I have no interest in. Ilya Lyubushkin signed in Buffalo. He's fine. Brent Burns, I wouldn't want. Mark Stahl, okay, he's in the back end of his career, $750,000 defenseman. There's no D signing today. So you keep, Manson would have been so coveted. You keep him away from other opponents. You keep him away from Western Conference teams that would have loved to scoop him up and beat you next season. So kudos to Colorado for keeping some key important players that they needed to in order to win another Stanley Cup next season. That's a great business today from Joe Sakic and the management team there in Colorado. And now Tampa. Tampa today, again, one UFA signing. They announced three big restricted free agents. Mikhail Sergachev, who's been phenomenal since arriving in Tampa. Anthony Cirelli, who is incredibly valuable, and Eric Chernak. All restricted free agents, all guys you want to keep. And what do they do in one day? They sign them all to 8-year extensions. Max extensions for all three of these guys. Sergachev's deal is 8 years, $68 million. That's 8.5 per. Cirelli's 8 years, 6.25, which to me is a steal. He would have played on the Olympic team this year. He's that good of a player. He can shut down an opposing team's top line. We've seen him do it this past year. He can penalty kill. He can score goals. He's a perfect number 2 center. And that number 2 centers make $6 million now. That's just the way it works. To me, I love Anthony Cirelli. Everything he brings to the table, great. And Chernak, 5.2 for Chernak. Yeah, he's not going to put up the most points, but he's tough as hell. He's fit. He'll block shots. He'll do anything to win. 8 years for these three signings are awesome for Tampa Bay. And they get the business done so quick. Julien Brisebois with these three guys. Sergachev deserves 8.5. He's an $8 million defenseman. He just is. Because guess what? On the open market, he'd be making that. Because he'd look at Miro Heiskanen. He'd look at some of these defensemen that make big money and say, you know what? I'm as good as them. He'd look at Darnell Nurse. He'd look at Morgan Riley's contract and say, I want a lot more than them. So to get him at 8.5, to get Cirelli at 6.25, and to get Chernak at 5.2, you just have to marvel at what they've done. Because I know I do. I think it's brilliant what they've been able to pull off. I credit what has happened today in these two organizations where they have the odds stacked against them. They don't have the advantage. Where they're in the hole where every other team has room. Most teams have cap space, unless you're a team that just spends and doesn't win anything, and there's a few of those teams out there. And yet they continue to remain competitive. They keep the key players that they had to. Would Colorado have loved to keep Nazem Kadri? Absolutely, but that's not going to happen. You know that. Tampa would have loved to keep Ryan McDonough, but that's just not the way the business works. There are going to be casualties. But they kept important pieces. Tampa's structure for the next number of years revolves around Braden Point, Andrei Vasilevsky, Sergachev, Cirelli, and Chernak. And you've got all four under contract for a long time. Stamkos will retire, and Tampa will still be in a position where they can compete year in, year out. After being to 3 straight Stanley Cups, you can look at Tampa and say, yes, they've gotten worse, but do I think this team can still compete next season? You bet your ass they can. I really credit these two teams and what they've done. How you stay competitive. You just went all the way, and you're making smart decisions to remain there, hopefully for a long time. I'm going to end the show talking about Pittsburgh, but I'm one team that really stands out to me today that didn't do anything is the Calgary Flames. They signed Kevin Rooney, who was with the New York Rangers. They signed Kevin Rooney, who's basically a fourth-line center. He doesn't bring a whole lot to the table. Nazem Kadri is available. I think they're going to do everything they can to get him. I mentioned Washington should be really in the mix on Nazem Kadri. New York got Trocheck, so I think that keeps them out of it. If New York is kicking tires on Gaudreau, I think New York should be kicking tires on the Islanders on Kadri. So you got Kadri, Gaudreau, Palat. John Klingberg is the best defenseman available. He's still out there. So there are a number of big-name free agents that remain unsigned. Right now. And there's also the potential of JT Miller getting moved, where he's been linked to the Islanders for a long time. Vancouver knows he's likely not going to resign, or he's not going to take the number they've offered, so that they might move him. So he's a possibility. So there's lots of moves that could still happen. And we'll have lots to talk about tomorrow and later this week, because if guys remain unsigned today and I go off the air today, we can talk about it tomorrow. So that's a positive thing as well, looking ahead. And also next week, something I mentioned, there's not a whole lot of content. We'll get to more into baseball, and just what I plan to do next week is talk about basically the All-Star break of the MLB season, where teams are, go over who got fired, how teams got to where they are, certain players that are having great seasons. But also I'm going to look back at free agency and teams that really got better and really got worse. I'll do a deep dive of that this weekend, and we'll touch on that as a big picture topic next week as well. So that's something that I will do next week. But let's finish with Pittsburgh. I mentioned they signed Jan Ruda. It's a good signing on the back end. But last night, I wake up to the Pittsburgh Penguins re-signing Evgeny Malkin. Pittsburgh is an organization that makes no sense to me. Chris Letang gets 6 years. I hate it. Still hate it. Makes no sense. Then the Pittsburgh Penguins re-sign Evgeny Malkin to a 4-year deal worth $6.1 million a season. And, oh, by the way, Evgeny Malkin's 35 years old, injury prone, and not even half the player that he used to be. If you're a Pittsburgh Penguin fan, you should be outraged today. You should be pissed off because this management team has screwed you. Evgeny Malkin in no way, shape, or form should be making $6.1 million. He's not a $4.5 million player anymore. These legacy contracts are the stupidest thing you can do in sports. They make no sense. They add no value, and they honestly hurt you more than they help. They do. Because you look around and say, wow, we have a bunch of old guys here that won 5 years ago that are still here. And oh wait, no, they don't say that they're 5 years older. They're injury prone, and Sidney Crosby's still fantastic. But who the hell is he going to play with? Can they re-sign Evan Rodriguez, who is a good fit in Pittsburgh, who has had the most success he's ever had? He should play with Crosby moving forward. He's a perfect fit. He's another Max Talbot, Pascal Dupuis type player. Funny enough, he wears number 9, just like Dupuis did. But Evgeny Malkin is spent. You should have let another team make the mistake that you just did, because you're not going to regret him coming back to play you X number of times this season, because I think he would have went to the nation's capital in Washington. But instead, you bring him back because he's been there forever and you felt like you owed him one. It's business. You owe nothing to anyone. That might sound cruel, but that's just the way it works. If you haven't figured that out yet, I can't help you. Stupid signing by Pittsburgh. They'll regret it. They deserve everything that happens to them. I have zero sympathy for the faults that they're going to happen. The games they're going to lose because of the fact that they didn't have a backbone to move on from a few guys that really had success with the organization. No doubt about it, but I don't care. Make the right decision. Make the right decision. Not the one that's going to keep the fan that has the Malkin jersey happy. The fan that's got the Malkin jersey will be happy raising the couple of Evgeny Malkin is in the KHL or in Washington, not a couple feet away. Anyway, be back tomorrow. Hope you fun show today. Lots of content. I could have kept going here. We do have some breaking news. Kevin Weeks. I'm told Maple Leafs are signing for Dennis Malgin to a 1-year contract. Dennis Malgin, who they traded for Mason Marchment back in the day, is back in Toronto. Not a big surprise. He's a forward that is under 6 feet, will not throw a body check, so that tracks with Maple Leafs and what they like to do with their roster. Anyway, I wanted to compliment the Leafs the whole day. I didn't want to say anything bad about their team, but Dennis Malgin, come on now. But hey, before I do too much of this, I'll be back tomorrow. Hope you guys enjoyed the show today. It's to the point.